Okay, time to make more cutting boards, part 2.
So as the name of the video implies, I will be making not one, but two plaid pattern cutting boards. For these cutting boards, I am going to be using 6 different species of wood. The majority of it's going to be walnut, cherry, hickory, and maple, with some white oak and paduk stripes running through it. So first things first, I am just going to the miter station to cut these all down to length. I believe I landed on 24 inches for each one of them, and here they are. For all of these pieces being rough cut, they were actually pretty darn flat, so I just went over to the thickness planer to bring them all down to the same thickness. And then once I had done that, I established a straight edge on one side of each. There they are, all cleaned up. And after that, it was time to go over to the table saw to rip them down to the correct widths. I landed on 7/8 here because that was actually the thickness of each one of them. So now I have perfect 7/8 inch squares coming out of this. Well, squares on the end grain side of things, at least. Once that was done, this is what I ended up with. And now it was time to interchange them. I decided to go with walnut on cherry and then hickory on maple. And this is just setting up for the first 2 glue ups of this whole process. With a bit of hindsight, I feel like I probably should have went maple on walnut and then cherry on hickory. If you plan on doing something like this, definitely pay attention to what the colors are and how they look together a little bit better than I did. You'll see here towards the end of the video what I'm talking about. As far as glue ups go, this one's pretty simple. Not like a lot of the monstrosities I've had in past videos, or ones yet to come for that matter. Now normally when I do glue ups, while the boards are in the clamps, I usually just take a wet rag to the boards and glue to clean up most of the mess. But this time around I decided to try a different method, and I just kind of let the glue dry where it was and used a scraper to clean up all of the squeeze out there. As I'm rewatching this, I think this is going to be my new preferred method going forward. But having said that, there was a little bit of the glue that was still stuck to the boards that the scraper couldn't get. You can kind of see there. So I decided to just kiss these boards with the planer, just enough to get that glue off. I was trying not to cut any wood, and it worked out pretty well. But still had to do some sanding as per usual. After getting the tops and bottoms of the boards cleaned up, it was time to clean up the end grains there. This is just as easy as putting it on the crosscut sled and cutting all of the ends off of each of the boards. After that, it was time to cut these down to what the cutting board thickness would be, or at least close to. I landed on 1.5 inches, same as last cutting board I made. This gives me a little bit of wiggle room for when I ultimately plane it down to its final thickness. For some reason I didn't film it, but what you're going to do after that is take each one of those boards, flip them on their end grain, and make a checkerboard pattern alternating between the cherry and walnut and hickory and maple. And full disclosure, you saw me there with the tape measure. One of these cutting boards is going to a friend who requested it be 10 inches by 16 inches. And the original plan was to make 2 cutting boards the same size, but I found out I wasn't going to be able to hit that mark because I guess my math was wrong. So I decided to pivot and make his board at 10 by 16, but then make the other board a bit smaller. And here's the result of that. Well, this is just them put together at the moment, but you can clearly see one's more of a square while the other is more of a rectangle. Now keep in mind this will be a plaid pattern, so I do have to add 1/4-inch strips of wood in between all those lines here soon. So this is the second glue up of this process, and let me tell you, it is very important. You see the checkered pattern there. I was not paying enough attention, and you can kind of see it here from the top that that board is definitely not square. It's kind of square, but all of those checker patterns are off by fractions of an inch. And you can't really tell at a glance, but if you look really close at it, you can tell that things don't quite line up. So if you're going to make one of these cutting boards, be sure to pay attention very closely while doing glue ups, because they can either make or break the entire pattern. And with the second glue up out of the way, it was then time to pivot and make some white oak strips out of this board here. First thing you got to do with this is figure out how long the strips need to be, because we will be gluing the edges of those 3 boards together in order to make the actual length once the boards are flipped on to the end grain. If you're going to make end grain strips, I would highly recommend having a resaw bandsaw, which I do not have, and you will see here in a minute once those dry up exactly how I did it, which I would not recommend to anyone. And with that third glue up, my workbench was getting pretty full, so I decided, hey, let's do another glue up. Now, this is the paduk, and if you may or may not know, paduk is very expensive. So I went ahead and bought it in 1/4-inch strips like I did the Purple Heart in the last video. And you can see there I had to go to the floor for this glue up because my workbench was full. And I just glued these strips together and then will later cut them down to size. With the workbench full, it was time to give these some time to dry up a little bit. And then I just took them all down to scrape off the excess glue and decided to call it a day. And here is where you can see what I was talking about earlier with the glue ups. You have to make sure that everything lines up. You can clearly see there that these boards aren't square. So I decided to go over to the crosscut stud and square everything up, which was actually a mistake. Later in this, you will see that in order to achieve this pattern, you actually cut these boards 2 more times, and I could have fixed it then. But now I'm stuck with some squares on the ends that are smaller and some that are bigger. So I forgot to record me cutting down these oak strips, but you can see there I used the table saw. Not recommended, definitely use a resaw bandsaw. So then it was time to work on the paduk. I decided to use my dull block plane to clean up that edge and then cut these down into the strips that I needed. In doing so, I realized I had enough for the 10 by 16 board, but not enough for the square board. So I decided to go ahead and make up what I had left and then use the offcuts from the 10 by 16 board to fill in the square board, which you will see me do later. Now it was back to the table saw to add in the oak strips. To do this, I cut the first checker pattern there in half, and then every other checker pattern you do the same thing. Cut it right in half, and then this is where those oak strips will go. And again, repeat the same process for the square board. And keep in mind, we'll be doing this again for the paduk the other way. So here I am seeing what needs to be cut down on the oak. So I take a strip of the actual board there and then bring the oak over to cut it down to the exact same length as the cutting board. This way, when I do the glue up, I can throw a clamp across widthways to make sure all the checker patterns line up and not make the same mistake I did last time. So now with the oak strips in, you can kind of see the plaid pattern starting to take form. And of course we have to glue that oak into this board. So that makes glue up number 5. Yeah, this is glue up number 5, I believe. If any of you out here are wanting to make a cutting board like this, just be prepared to make a lot of glue ups, because after this, there's still one more. Though there are a lot of glue ups, they are not too monstrous, as you can see there. Now that I got these all dried and ready to go, man, this is like the 6th time you've seen me do this, but it was time to then scrape off all the glue and get them prepped for the next round of strips. As I had said earlier, for this next round of strips, we are now going to go perpendicular to the oak strips that we had just put in and cut the board as many times as you need to hit the every other checker pattern mark. You can't really tell from the video, but you could kind of see the sawdust isn't really getting collected, and that's because I had a nasty clog inside the dust collection there. That's what happens when you don't turn on your dust collection every time you use the saw. So don't be like me, kids. And this is the final step here, adding the paduk strips to the plaid pattern. And it doesn't look very good there, but trust me, it looks a lot better once it's glued up. But here I've got to cut down the strips for the square board, and I'm literally using all the paduk I have, which isn't enough to fill it in. So I used some of the offcuts from the 10x16 to fill in those little gaps there towards the end, and I had just enough to fill out both boards with paduk. And you could see me here just cutting them down at the miter station. When you're cutting little boards like this, go slow and steady. Definitely be sure to not go too fast, or it could make the wood explode. I've had it happen in the past, and trust me, that is a heart attack waiting to happen. So here is the final layout. And before I could do the final glue up, I had one other glue up to do, which is those little offcut pieces of paduk to extend the boards for the square cutting board. I'm doing this the same way I glue up every 1/4-inch boards. It's just much smaller in this instance, but it turned out okay. You can't see the seams once everything is done, and it looks pretty good. If you've seen any of my past videos, you know I refuse to show you all me just standing there sanding. But just so you know, every time I use the table saw, I do have to sand these down to get rid of the saw marks. Now these paduk strips for the square board are dry and ready to go. It's time for the 7th, 8th. This is the final glue up, okay? I promise. I kind of spoke on this a little bit in this video, but if anything, learn from my mistakes here. When you are doing these glue ups, make sure everything is lined up perfect. Don't get too hasty, and keep in mind that the more that you pay attention, the better the board is going to turn out. Having said that, these boards aren't a complete failure by any means, but I just feel like that they could have been a little bit better looking if I had taken my time when it came to these glue ups. And you've seen me do this 1,000 times, so we're going to go ahead and skip ahead. And here's what I ended up with. If you look close, these boards, they start with the cherry and walnut, but then they end on the hickory maple, and I just didn't like how uneven it looked. So even though my friend, he wanted a 10x16 board, I ended up cutting the square board and the rectangle board down just to get rid of that hickory and maple end. Having said that, Jason, if you're watching, please forgive me. If you've seen my previous video, then you know this part. I am cutting down some sacrificial boards to the same width as these cutting boards in order to send them through the planer. Oh, yeah, I know. Ingrained through the planer, big no-no. But if you watch my previous video, it worked out perfect for that cutting board. It was a brick pattern cutting board, though, and it had much bigger squares. It still worked for these cutting boards, but you'll see here in a minute that it didn't work quite as well as the last one. Once those boards dried on, it was then time to, well, cross my fingers and hope that everything works out. You can see me there. I sent these through quite a few times between the two of them. Even sped up, I ended up having to edit out a lot of the passes. Keep in mind as well, I am just barely kissing these boards with the planer. I am trying to take off as little amount as possible. And here's what I ended up with. From a distance, they look great, but once you get up close, oh yeah, right around the edges, on the sides and towards the front, it's just some nasty tear out on that walnut. Lucky for me though, it was pretty well contained to just the outer rim of the cutting boards. All the tear outs seemed to happen on the edges, so I had a quick fix for that. But first it was time to square these up and get those sacrificial boards off, which is what I'm doing here. You could see on that first one, this is where I decided to get rid of the hickory and maple strips there on the ends. And aside from that, I'm also trying to square up these boards as much as I possibly can and try to make everything look straight. And here's what I ended up with. Two small to medium-sized cutting boards there. And I decided to go with some CA glue to clean up the edge tear outs there. It's not in the middle of the cutting board, it's on the edges, so it's not like anyone's going to be cutting into the glue, and it makes it look a whole heck of a lot better in the end. And with the tear out fixed up and these boards to their final dimensions, it was time to do some juice groove. And if you watched my last video, you will notice that I am still using that same sacrificial fence, and with a little bit more of a modification there to keep the whole thing down. But 3 passes each on the square cutting board there to get the juice groove going. And then for the second board, it's actually going to be a double-sided board. So I did 3 passes here on this side to get the juice groove in. And then once I had gotten that side done, it was time to flip it over and do it all over again. With the juice grooves out of the way, it was on to the finger grooves. Same setup as the last video, just the sacrificial fence clamped down with 2 sacrificial pieces of 1/4-inch plywood as start and stop points that are double-sided taped down. For the square board, I'm literally doing the same thing I did on the last cutting board. A nice chamfered bottom with a round over on top. And then for the double-sided board, it was just roundovers on the top and bottom. Also, I went ahead and gave the square board 4 finger grooves instead of the traditional 2, like on the rectangle one. Now here is where you can see my errors. The juice groove is straight, but those squares, you could see them getting bigger and smaller. It's definitely not straight. That one pretty much disappears at the end, and it was very prevalent there at the beginning. The square cutting board turned out a lot better as far as the squareness of everything, but it's still just a little off. Off screen, of course, I did some sanding, and I forgot to mention in the last video that in between grits, I always do a water pop to kind of raise the grain there. I started out at 80 grit, then went to 100, and ended at 120. It's a cutting board, no need to go any further than that if you ask me. And now it's time for the grand finale. Same as my last video with my last cutting board, I am using walrus oil once again for both of these boards. This is usually everyone's favorite part in watching these types of videos, so I'm going to go ahead and shut my yapper and just let you guys watch. Now, when doing a walrus oil finish, they recommend that you let the board sit like this for about 6 to 12 hours before wiping everything off. I am pretty impatient, so I waited exactly 6 hours and then came back to wipe these off, and this is what we ended up with. Like I said earlier in the video, you can kind of see that the pattern kind of blends in together once you applied the finish. This is why I should have put the walnut on the maple rather than the cherry, but all in all, it's looking pretty good. With this square cutting board, I went ahead and did the same thing that I did in the previous video with the brick pattern cutting board, and just threw these little legs here on the bottom. And here's the final product. All the hiccups I ran into building these two cutting boards aside, this was still a lot of fun. And if you want to see me build more cutting boards, tune in next week when I try to figure out exactly how to do a 3D pattern cutting board. I have a weird way of figuring these cutting boards out. With that, we'll see you in the next one. Thank you.